Let's go now to slide 14 in the slide deck, titled Knowledge. So knowledge is any information the perceiver brings to a situation. Okay, so basically knowledge is going to be your past experiences with the situation, as well as your expectations. And when we talk about how knowledge influences a particular user's or a particular person's perceptions, we talk about knowledge from two perspectives: bottom up and top down. Okay, so bottom up processing is when we take the stimuli that we are perceiving and we put those stimuli together to build up some representation of a perception, right? So we go from the bottom, from the little pieces, all the way up to constructing some representation of something that we that we know. So for example, if you look at something you've never seen before, right? If you look at you say, for example, you see like a weird bug that you've never seen before. You're going to be putting together all the pieces of information, all the different textures and patterns and shapes that you see, relative sizes that you see, to form this image of a bug, right? To eventually come to the conclusion that yes, I'm looking at a bug, and it looks like it might be a moth or a cockroach or something, right? But it's processing the information based on the stimuli themselves, right? Top-down processing is the opposite, in essence, of bottom-up processing. Top-down processing is where we're processing something, where we're building a representation of something based on what we know or based on what we expect, right? For example, you may already, when you're driving, right, as you're seeing the flow of traffic go by you, right, your perception of the location of yourself relative to the other cars, and your perception of the location of the other cars is based largely on top-down processing. You're not looking at every single car as you're driving and calculating the location of every single car as you're driving, right? You kind of get a general idea what the flow is, and then you guess, you construct this model in your head of where the cars are. And most of the time that works, right? Most of the time, the vast majority of the time that works. That's a really good way to navigate the world, right? Is to have this this model of what you expect based on your past knowledge. It doesn't work sometimes when a car does something unexpectedly, right? And that's when you should have been paying more attention, right? Or let's say a car brakes suddenly in front of you. That's when you switch from your top-down model to your bottom-up model, right? All of a sudden you're focused on that car, and you're watching the lights and the way it's moving, right? You're paying very close attention to that car because it's moving in an unusual way that you don't expect. And you have to watch its movements second by second, minute by minute. So you can't use your top-down model to understand what that car is doing. You have to go to your bottom-up model. This slide on figure 15 is a copy of the one that's on page 9 of your textbook, and this kind of brings together this notion of top down and bottom up, right? So from the incoming data is our bottom up. It's what we're building. So we're building this image, right? This woman is perceiving a bug on a tree, right? And so at first you're using your bottom-up processing to bring the stimuli in and to focus on what the stimuli are. Eventually, you build up enough of a representation so you go to your top-down model and say, hey, that's a moth, right? There are a lot of different, if you go into the next slide, slide 16 in your slide deck, there are a lot of different types of models that we use to study, lots of approaches that we use to study perception, right? So first, you can pick what stage in the pathway, going all the way from stimuli to action, you want to look at things, right? So for example, you can be a psychophysicist. And these are individuals who look at the relationship between the stimulus and the perception, right? So how much, for example, how much of a certain stimulus evokes a certain type of perception? What types of stimuli evoke certain types of perceptions, right? This might sound kind of lame or boring, but it's not. There are people who do research on, for example, build or design concert halls. People who design airplanes and cars and even your cell phones, right? There are psychophysicists who, for example, will design different ways that your phone can vibrate, or different ways that your smartwatch can vibrate to alert you to certain things, right? These are all these different types of relationships that exist between different forms of energy in our environment and our perceptions, and there are people that study that and can manipulate that. The physiological approach to studying the relationship between stimulus and physiology. In other words, once a stimulus hits some receptor in the body, what does it do, right? It lights up or it activates certain neurons and neural pathways. What does it do, right? I mean, what's the wiring? What's the stage of events inside the body? What are the chemicals? What are the proteins? Even what are the genetic factors involved in perceiving a stimulus at the physiological level? And then there's another physiological approach you can take, the physiology perception, right? So in other words, what's the relationship between the wiring of the structure of our organs in our body, and the perceptual system of our body, all the neural structure. What's the relationship between all of that and what we perceive, right? So this is the type of research that I did for a while, looking at pain processing, right? In other words, trying to understand the relationship between a painful stimulus, which in my case was injecting formaldehyde, a little very weak formaldehyde solution into the skin, and how different parts of the brain process that pain information. Okay, that's an example. If we go to slide 17, all of these stages, right? All these stages between physiology and the stimulus, and they're all interconnected. It's all part of one whole, right? And all these processes are all linked together. So that's part of the problem. The other thing too is the cognitive influences on perception. We know now that our prior knowledge, our expectations, even our language affects how we perceive things. There's a study that came out just a few years ago that showed that people whose native tongue is English can't perceive very slightly different differences in the color blue, different shades of blue. If you speak English as your mother tongue, you can't perceive that. But if you speak Russian as your mother tongue, you can actually perceive these different changes in the color blue. That's because Russians have different words for very slight changes in the shades of the color blue. They have different words for those, different terms for those different shades of blue. And because they have those different terms, they're able to perceive those colors differently than English speakers do. So there's a huge area of research as well on looking at the cognitive influences on perception as well. Like I said, if you go to slide 18, right, the relationship between stimuli, perception, and physiology, it's all interlinked, right? So, for example, looking at the relationship between stimuli and physiology, right? In ferrets, horizontal stimuli generate a larger brain response than slanted stimuli. So horizontal stimuli like this generate a much more stronger brain response than stimuli like this. We're going to talk about that, the different detection of different slanted lines in the visual cortex of certain animals. Then looking at the relationship between physiology and perception, right? So the structure of our nervous systems and how we perceive, right? One example of that, the relationship between physiology and perception, people have a larger brain response when detecting horizontal stimuli than when detecting slanted stimuli, which is kind of interesting. So we're much better at detecting things that are like this or like this than if they're like this. When they're slanted, we have a little bit more trouble detecting and seeing fine detail between the lines, as opposed to when things are straight up or horizontal. Looking at the relationship between stimuli and perception, people detect horizontal and vertical stimuli more easily than slanted stimuli, which is, this effect is known as the oblique effect, right? So there's a lot of different ways to look at this same phenomenon, right? This phenomenon of being able to detect horizontal stimulus versus vertical stimulus versus slanted stimulus. A lot of different perspectives you can take on it. Looking at the relationship between physiology and perception, or stimuli and perception, or stimuli and physiology, right? And we see this here in slide 19, right? In slide 19, we have an individual looking at two different stimuli, right? Looking at stimuli that slanted lines that are close together and slanted lines that are far apart. When lines are slanted like that, we have a much more difficult time telling how far apart they are, right? We're able to, they have to be pretty far apart for us to detect differences in how far apart they are. It's a lot easier for us to do that when the lines are horizontal or vertical. We can detect very easily very small changes between, say, this and this, or this and this. Whereas if lines are slanted, it takes a bigger change for us to detect a difference, right? And that's what's being shown here, right? Basically, the fact that it takes a bigger change in the slant of the lines before we're able to perceive a difference. Before we can say, oh yeah, those two lines have moved apart. They are different from each other. Okay, on slide 20, we have this ferret, right? And we've studied this effect, this phenomenon, this oblique effect in the brains of ferrets, and it turns out that certain areas of the brain respond much better to vertical and horizontal lines than they do to oblique or slanted lines. Which tells us that most of our brains, at least most of the mammalian brain, the visual apparatus in the mammalian brain is devoted to looking for these more simple types of patterns where lines going up and down, or simply horizontal, or going across, or horizontally or vertically. Oblique lines kind of do both, right? They go horizontal and vertical at the same time. So they're a little bit more difficult to detect, and our brains are not quite as wired to detect those as they are to detect horizontal lines or vertical lines. We're the same. If you look at slide 21, right, you see this pretty smiling lady looking at you, right? And it's telling us that we're much better able to detect horizontal differences in horizontal lines than we are at oblique lines. And our brains are the same as the ferret brain. We have the exact same responses to these stimuli as ferret brains do, right? When we look at humans processing this information using different techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging or PET scans, we see that we have much more robust brain responses. Much more robust brain responses to horizontal or vertical lines than we do to slanted lines. And similarly, our perception, or our ability to detect differences in how far apart the lines are, is much better when the lines are horizontal or vertical as opposed to when they are slanted. The take-home message of all of that, all those slides, is to tell you there's a number of different ways to look at phenomena, perceptual phenomena. Looking at the relationship between the stimuli and the physiology, the stimuli and the perception, or the relationship between the physiology and the perception. Okay, all of those different things are active areas of study and are going to be all the different perspectives we're going to be looking at. So that pattern that you saw back on slide 18, this pattern you're going to see in all the chapters. All the chapters are going to have research that shows the relationship that shows the relationship among these three things. So look for it. Look for it in all the chapters. Look for this relationship. If you have trouble understanding the research that you're reading in a future chapter, go back to this slide and try to figure out what they're talking about. If you're reading some research and you don't get it, go back to this slide and ask yourself, are they talking about physiology to perception? Are they talking about stimuli to physiology? Or are they talking about stimuli to perception? And that'll help you to understand it a little bit. Measuring perception. Oops. All right. Oh, I ran out of time. Let me stop this and start on a new section.